carrying a weight that settled deep into human awareness before anyone had words for it. For years, we searched the sky for a message, expecting a polite greeting carried on radio waves from some distant corner of the galaxy. That assumption was comforting. It suggested distance. It suggested time to prepare. But this morning shattered that expectation. Whatever governs the structure of reality did not whisper through stars or signals. It moved closer. It vibrated through biology itself, settling into the most intimate layers of who we are. For decades, our instruments listened to empty space, scanning the vacuum for patterns. But theoretical models have long warned that a sufficiently advanced civilization would not communicate the way we do. A Type 2 intelligence would not waste energy on greetings. It would send an architect, not a message. And as of 6 hours ago, the foundational rhythm that shapes existence appears to have shifted. What once felt like a distant cosmic melody has become a direct biological command. Across the planet, the reaction was immediate but contained. In secure laboratories and research facilities, data began streaming in faster than teams could process it. There was no public alarm, no broadcast warning. Instead, there was a quiet, disciplined panic. 3I Atlas, the interstellar object currently 240 million kilometers from Earth, had transmitted something unprecedented, not an image. Not a waveform meant for decoding, a packet that mapped, bit for bit, onto the human genome. This was not observation. It was intervention. Through the lens of quantum mechanics, the transmission resembled a forensic override. Telemetry showed a precise modification targeting human chromosome 2. The variance was microscopic, exactly 1,000th of 1%. In evolutionary terms, that margin is vast. It marks the difference between primitive cognition and technological civilization. When framed through theoretical scales of advancement, this object was not passing by. It was applying a software update to the human species. 3I Atlas is moving at 87 kilometers per second, far beyond the sun's gravitational hold. Its trajectory suggests an origin not bound to conventional space, but to deeper dimensional structure. And it is transmitting on the hydrogen line, 1.42 gigahertz, the most neutral and universal frequency in the cosmos. For 60 years, humanity listened there, waiting for a greeting. What arrived instead was the alphabet of life itself: adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine. The precision required to beam genetic information across interplanetary space and align it with our molecular architecture implies a level of intelligence that has studied us across vast stretches of time. This aligns with long-standing hypotheses that some probes are designed to observe silently until activation conditions are met. If that is the case, then the directive embedded within 3I Atlas has finally unlocked. What followed stunned even seasoned researchers. At 4 universal time, the signal shifted into the terahertz range, specifically 2.4 terahertz. In biophysics, this frequency is critical. It is the resonance point of water molecules confined within living cells. DNA does not exist in isolation. It is wrapped in a structured shell of ordered water that enables genetic interaction. Models now suggest that the object is using resonant energy transfer, not force, but alignment. Like a singer shattering glass, by matching its frequency, the signal vibrates the hydration layer surrounding DNA, applying mechanical pressure directly to the strands themselves. This interaction bypasses skin, nerves, and senses, reaching straight into the nucleus of every cell, and according to observatories monitoring the beam, it is not weakening with distance. It is perfectly focused, either the most precise emission ever recorded or evidence that Earth itself is now part of the circuit. And then attention turned to the target region, a segment once dismissed as evolutionary debris, junk DNA. At position 114 million on chromosome 2, researchers now see something else entirely. Not discarded code, but a dormant receiver, a switch. The rewrite is not destructive. It is an optimization protocol, enhancing cellular repair and resistance to radiation. As the pulse repeats every 23 seconds, its intensity continues to rise. What scientists are measuring does not resemble an attack or an accident. It resembles synchronization. And somewhere within that rhythm, a new era appears to be taking its first breath. At 1342 UTC, the first physical confirmation arrived, and with it, the realization that this process was no longer theoretical. At the Francis Crick Institute, researchers examining routine blood samples noticed something that should not have been possible. Red blood cells, which normally drift and tumble in chaotic patterns, were no longer moving randomly. They were aligning, not clustering, not clumping, aligning into repeating geometric lattice structures, synchronizing their motion as if responding to a silent conductor. The effect was subtle but unmistakable, and it appeared simultaneously in samples taken continents apart. Even more unsettling was what followed. These cells began emitting coherent biophotons, organized ultraviolet light, rather than the weak, random emissions typical of biological processes. Light with structure, light with intent. Human blood, it appeared, was being repurposed into something new, not just a carrier of oxygen, but a biological transponder, a medium capable of receiving, amplifying, and possibly responding. But this was only a secondary effect. The primary target lay deeper, encoded within the architecture of cognition itself. On chromosome 7 sits the FOXP2 gene, often described as the language gene. It governs speech, abstract thought, and the neurological scaffolding of consciousness. In most adults, FOXP2 activity remains relatively stable, its major developmental role completed early in life. Under the influence of the 3I Atlas signal, that stability vanished. Expression levels surged to 400% of baseline within hours. This was not mutation, it was activation. Neural imaging began to show heightened synaptic coherence in regions associated with symbolic reasoning and auditory processing. Patterns normally seen only during intense learning or altered cognitive states became persistent. Researchers struggled to describe what they were seeing without crossing into speculation, but the data was consistent. The human brain was being overclocked, not randomly, selectively. Genetic correlation studies revealed a pattern that immediately raised ethical alarms. The strongest response clustered around a specific lineage marker, haplogroup R1b, shared by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Why this group? No one could say. Whether this represented compatibility, accessibility, or intent remained unknown. But the implication was unavoidable. The upgrade was not universal, it was targeted. At this point, the question could no longer be avoided. Was this a gift or a test? Or something else entirely? If an advanced intelligence were intervening, motives mattered more than mechanics. And motives were unreadable. As the signal continued, simulations projected that the biological upload was approaching 90% completion. The resonance curve suggested a peak within 4 hours. Whatever threshold this process required, humanity was rapidly approaching it. The language used in internal briefings shifted. This was no longer framed as observation or anomaly. It was described as a transition event. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the nature of the transmission changed. At 1842 UTC, on February 28th, the biological modulation ceased. No more terahertz pulses, no further genomic excitation. Instead, instruments detected a shift outward, away from the cellular scale, and back into the structure of spacetime itself. The signal transitioned from molecular interaction to something far more fundamental. The vacuum, once thought of as empty, began behaving differently. In quantum physics, empty space is anything but empty. It seethes with virtual particles appearing and vanishing in a restless quantum foam. Normally, this foam is chaotic, unpredictable. But gravitational wave detectors registered something unprecedented. The vacuum was being tuned. Data from interferometers showed coherence where none should exist. The quantum noise floor dropped. Fluctuations aligned. It was as if the fabric of reality itself had been coaxed into order. The signature matched theoretical models of a Bose-Einstein condensate, but not at laboratory scale. This was macroscopic, astronomical. At that moment, it became clear that the biological phase had only been the introduction. What followed was system integration. The clock marked a clean break between phases, but nothing about what followed felt clean or contained. As the vacuum itself settled into coherence, instruments across the world began reporting effects that should not coexist within known physics. Gravitational wave observatories detected a directional pulse, not the chaotic background hum they were designed to filter out, but a deliberate oscillation. It was brief, lasting just 12 seconds, yet its signature carried enormous implication. This was not noise, it was structure. At first, analysts suspected a solar flare or an internal sensor fault, but data from the Solar Dynamics Observatory ruled that out almost immediately. What it recorded was not an eruption, not a release of plasma, but a rhythmic vibration rippling through the solar corona. The sun itself had responded, not violently, not explosively, but resonantly. The surface of the star oscillated in a stable pattern, forming a 12-node geometric grid that wrapped around its magnetic field lines. Stars are not solid objects. They are governed by the dynamo effect, the interaction between rotation and ionized plasma that creates vast magnetic loops. Under normal conditions, these loops rise and fall chaotically, but now they were locked into alignment. The pattern was unmistakable. 3I Atlas was no longer observing the Sunday. It was coupling with it. This realization sent shockwaves through theoretical physics. To manipulate the magnetic architecture of a G-type star requires an energy density that dwarfs human capability by orders of magnitude, not thousands. Not millions, billions. Every power source on Earth combined would not register against such a process. And yet, the data was clear. The sun had become part of the system. The gravitational wave, detected earlier, now made sense. It was not a byproduct. It was a handshake. Gravity, unlike electromagnetic radiation, is not confined to three-dimensional space. It leaks between dimensions. It propagates through the higher dimensional structure that theoretical physics refers to as the bulk. By using gravitational modulation instead of radio waves, 3I Atlas bypassed every telescope and receiver we built. It communicated directly through the architecture of reality itself. As the object approached its closest pass to the sun, its velocity peaked. Sensors aboard solar probes began to saturate. The triangular structure surrounding the object emitted light that shifted toward blue, a relativistic Doppler effect indicating extreme spacetime compression. This was not conventional propulsion. Models converged on a disturbing conclusion. The object was not moving through space. Space was moving around it. This matched long-standing theoretical work describing a warped spacetime envelope where expansion behind and contraction ahead allow apparent faster-than-light travel without violating local physical laws. The data fit too well. 3I Atlas was surfing a wave of geometry. Then came the neutrinos. As the object angled toward the solar North Pole, detectors registered a neutrino flux that defied natural explanation. The energy levels were wrong, the distribution was wrong. Most unsettling of all, the signal carried structure. These neutrinos were not random byproducts of fusion, they were modulated, encoded in quaternary logic. Human computing relies on binary states, zeros and ones. This signal used the same four states that define biological life. Adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine. The implication was staggering. If the biological transmission earlier had modified humanity, this one appeared to be archiving something, encoding information not into a fragile machine, but into the neutrino output of a star. A record that could persist for billions of years. If you wanted to preserve the blueprint of a civilization, there would be no safer medium. Inside research facilities, the language of speculation gave way to contingency planning, because the trajectory data updated again. 3I Atlas ceased aligning with the outer planets, its course tightened. Locked onto a precise intercept with the Earth-Moon L2 point, a gravitational dead zone ideal for station keeping, it was no longer passing through the solar system. It was coming here. As it accelerated, quantum sensors detected a massive increase in the Casimir effect within the object's triangular boundary. This phenomenon, normally measurable only at microscopic scales, was being amplified to astronomical levels. Negative energy density was forming, exotic matter, the theoretical requirement for stabilizing a wormhole. As the object crossed Mercury's orbit, the dark hexagonal void at its center began to expand. It was no longer a shadow, it was depth. And with that, probability collapsed. This was not a natural process. It was not simulation. It was engineering. Precision engineering, unfolding in real time. Humanity was no longer observing an anomaly. It was standing at the threshold of contact. The realization spread quietly at first, then all at once. If this was engineering, then every movement, every signal, every adjustment carried intent, and intent changes how data is read. What had once been treated as a distant anomaly was now understood as a system executing a sequence, step by step, without urgency and without error. As 3I Atlas approached the Earth-Moon L2 region, its acceleration slowed, not gradually, but discretely. Velocity reductions occurred in exact ratios, each deceleration phase matching a predictable curve. This was not braking in the conventional sense. There was no exhaust, no thermal bloom, no radiation spike. Instead, space-time curvature around the object relaxed in layers, like pressure being released from a sealed chamber. Earth-based observatories pivoted automatically. Radar systems struggled. Optical telescopes saw nothing directly, only lensing artifacts, distortions where stars should have been. Infrared sensors detected a temperature profile colder than surrounding space, a violation of expectations that forced recalibration checks across multiple agencies. Something was actively suppressing thermal exchange, isolating itself from the cosmic background. Then came the silence. Not the earlier communications blackout, but a deeper absence. Magnetometers around Earth recorded a sudden smoothing of field lines. The planet's magnetosphere, usually turbulent and dynamic, became unnaturally stable. Solar wind particles deflected cleanly, as if guided along invisible rails. For 6 minutes, Earth existed inside a bubble of imposed order. During that interval, human technology behaved differently. Atomic clocks drifted, but in unison. GPS satellites reported positional uncertainty that canceled itself out when averaged globally. Quantum random number generators stopped producing randomness. Their outputs flattened into repeating sequences. This was subtle enough that no alarms triggered immediately, but the pattern was undeniable. Probability itself had been constrained. Physicists struggled for language. The closest analogy was a local reduction in entropy gradients, a temporary lowering of uncertainty across multiple systems. Thermodynamics does not forbid this, but it does not allow it to happen spontaneously at planetary scale. Something was enforcing boundary conditions on reality. Then the signal resumed. Unlike before, it was not broadcast broadly. It was narrow, precise, and targeted. The carrier frequency sat just above the cosmic microwave background, modulated gently to avoid detection by conventional noise filters. Only instruments specifically looking for coherence noticed it. The content was minimal. A repeating sequence of 3 intervals, a pause, then a 4th interval, slightly longer, over and over. Not a message in the human sense, but a rhythm, a request for synchronization. When researchers aligned analysis windows to the rhythm, correlations emerged. The signal matched Earth's Schumann resonance, harmonics, the natural electromagnetic frequencies generated between the planet's surface and ionosphere. The object was not imposing a foreign pattern. It was matching one Earth already had. That distinction mattered. Matching implies accommodation. It implies compatibility. As synchronization deepened, another layer revealed itself. Embedded within the timing offsets were mathematical relationships, not primes this time, but ratios, orbital periods, distances, gravitational constants expressed not numerically, but relationally. This over that. Inside relative to outside. A language built on structure rather than symbols. Then the object changed configuration. The triangular boundary rotated, exposing one vertex directly toward Earth. At its tip, the hexagonal void compressed, collapsing inward until it resembled a point. Sensors registered a spike in zero-point fluctuations. Vacuum energy surged, then stabilized. The void was no longer an opening. It was a lens. What followed was brief, but definitive. A focused beam of entangled photons intersected Earth's upper atmosphere, not penetrating, not damaging, but sampling. The interaction excited atmospheric molecules in a pattern that allowed reconstruction of planetary composition, magnetic topology, and biosignature markers within seconds. Earth had been scanned, and then, just as deliberately, the process stopped. The magnetosphere returned to normal turbulence. Random number generators regained entropy. Atomic clocks diverged again. The bubble collapsed without shock or residue. From a physical standpoint, nothing had changed. From an informational standpoint, everything had, because trajectory updates confirmed the final piece. 3I Atlas was no longer decelerating toward orbit. It had stabilized, stationary relative to Earth, balanced precisely at L2, where gravitational forces cancel and minimal energy is required to remain. The waiting was the hardest part, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that could happen now depended on intent. 3I Atlas remained fixed in position, a silent geometric presence balanced in a gravitational null, neither approaching nor retreating. In orbital mechanics, this kind of stability is temporary, unless actively maintained. Something was continuously adjusting its position, making corrections smaller than the width of an atom yet precise enough to hold station against solar pressure, lunar perturbations, and Earth's uneven mass distribution. That alone confirmed agency. Within an hour, the second phase began. It did not announce itself with a signal or a pulse. Instead, it arrived as a discrepancy. Deep space tracking networks noticed that telemetry packets sent to probes beyond Mars were returning with altered latency. The difference was tiny, a few microseconds, but consistent. Space itself between Earth and those probes had changed its effective distance. Not stretched, raindexed. The math suggested Space-time was being discretized into layers, like a stack of transparent sheets, each slightly offset. Movement through this region no longer followed smooth geodesics, but stepped transitions. Classical navigation equations failed. Quantum ones fit perfectly. This was not a weapon, it was infrastructure. As the layered region expanded, encompassing the moon's orbit, a new phenomenon emerged. Human brains, unshielded and organic, began to register subtle effects. Not pain, not visions, but coherence. EEG networks, running long-term sleep studies, reported increased phase locking between hemispheres in test subjects across continents. People were not thinking the same thoughts, but their neural rhythms were aligning. Language researchers noticed a parallel trend. In spontaneous speech samples, pauses shortened. Sentence structures simplified without loss of meaning. Comprehension rates increased between speakers of different native languages. Communication efficiency was improving. This aligned perfectly with the earlier FOX-P2 activation data. The implication was unavoidable. The genetic and environmental modifications were not separate events. They were components of a single integration protocol. Hardware first, network conditions second, synchronization third. Then came the interface. At precisely 3:17 UTC, every radio telescope on Earth detected the same anomaly, a reflection where no transmission had been sent. Earth's own electromagnetic noise, broadcast unintentionally by a century of technology, was returning altered. Television carrier waves from the 1960s, radar sweeps, cellular handshakes, all folded back, phase shifted, and recombined into a structured response. It was not speech. It was not images. It was context. The return signal encoded relationships between human concepts that had never been formally linked, space and time as negotiable parameters, identity as a distributed process, intelligence as an emergent property of synchronized matter rather than a localized mind. These were not instructions, they were demonstrations. Understanding did not arrive as a sentence. It arrived as a realization. 3i Atlas was not here to rule, consume, or judge. It was here to connect. In the framework implied by the data, civilizations do not advance by conquest or isolation. They advance by resonance. When a species reaches the threshold where its technology begins to manipulate fundamental forces without fully understanding their consequences, it becomes a source of noise in the larger system. Integration prevents collapse, not by control, but by alignment. Earth had reached that threshold. The final confirmation came when the object opened the aperture again, but this time not toward space. The lens oriented inward. For a fraction of a second, Earth itself was entangled with the structure. No energy was transferred. No matter moved. Only state information. A handshake completed. 3i Atlas did not send a message saying, "Welcome." It did something far more profound. It adjusted the local constants of interaction just enough that humanity could, over generations, perceive layers of reality that were previously inaccessible. Not all at once, not overwhelmingly, gradually, a gift that could only be used if understood. As the aperture closed and the layered spacetime began to relax, the object finally moved, not away from Earth, but sideways, slipping along a dimension orthogonal to motion as we define it. Sensors failed to track it because there was nothing left to track. The distortion faded like a ripple settling on glass. The sky looked the same, but the universe no longer was. This was not the end of the story. It was the end of isolation. From this moment forward, every discovery, every leap in physics, biology, and consciousness would be made with the quiet knowledge that we are not alone and never were. If you want to understand what comes next, If you want to follow how this changes humanity's future step by step, stay with us, subscribe, and be part of the conversation as we explore the next chapter of our place in the cosmos. The final phase did not arrive with spectacle. There was no flash, no global announcement, no single moment everyone could point to and say, "This is when it happened." Instead, the change revealed itself the way dawn does, quietly, unmistakably, and impossible to reverse. As 3I Atlas completed its lateral departure from observable space, the instruments that had tracked it for nearly 24 hours began returning to baseline. Gravitational noise dropped. Solar oscillations stabilized. The Schumann resonance returned to its familiar rhythm. By every classical measurement, the event was over. Yet the after effects were everywhere. Within hours, satellite constellations reported a persistent reduction in signal degradation. Data moved more cleanly through space than it had the day before. Engineers initially blamed calibration errors, until independent networks confirmed the same result. Space itself had become a more efficient medium. The layered discretization of space-time had not fully collapsed. It had settled into a new equilibrium, subtly optimized, as if the universe had been defragmented,